Good evening and welcome. I'm Carl Gerth, a professor of modern Chinese history here at UCSD. It's my honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Arne Westad of Yale University. Before I introduce him, however, I would like to thank Susan Shirk, Lei Guang, and Sam Tsui of the 21st Century China Center for hosting this event. I'd also like to thank the Institute for Arts and Humanities of UCSD for co-sponsoring the event. And of course, thank you all for coming. Our format today is that Professor Westad will speak for around 30 minutes. Then Professor Robert Edelman of UCSD's History Department will begin the discussion for around 10 minutes. Finally, we'll save the end of the hour for question and answer from you, the audience, which I will moderate. Your questions will appear in my Q&A, which I will then read or paraphrase. If all goes to plan, we'll be done in an hour. So then, how do I introduce a scholar who has published 16 books? Generally speaking, Professor Westad is an authority on modern, international, and global history, specializing in the history of East Asia since the 18th century. He studied at the University of Oslo and then earned his PhD in US and international history at the University of North Carolina as a student of Michael Hunt's. Before taking up his current position at Yale, Professor Westad taught at the London School of Economics, where I first met him, and at Harvard University. In the first part of his career, Professor Westad mainly focused on the history of the Cold War, on Sino-Soviet relations, and on the history of the Chinese Civil War and the Chinese Communist Party. Since the mid-2000s, Professor Westad has been concerned more with general aspects of post-colonial and global history. Today, we have asked him to speak on another project he is working on with Chen Jian on China's late 20th century economic reforms and their impacts on the world. Please join me in welcoming Professor Westad.
Happy to be here, Bob, virtually now. So I want to thank you and Carl and Susan and Sam and others for setting this up. So hopefully at some point soon we can repeat this in person. It's almost much nicer to be in San Diego in person than speaking through San Diego to other people who I'm sure are in different locations across the country and perhaps outside the country as well. So the project I'm going to be talking about today is one that we are now, I would say, about 2/3 through. And it's a history of China during the origins of reform and opening. So it goes roughly from the late 1960s and up to the early mid-1980s. And I should stress that this is a jointly written work. It's the first time I've written a book together with someone else. And I'm writing it with my good friend and very dear colleague, Professor Chen Jian, who used to be at Cornell University, but is now at NYU, mainly NYU Shanghai, but also NYU New York. So we are now revising some of the chapters. We still have a couple of chapters to go, 3 chapters to go, but we are getting there on this project. So the purpose of the project is to try to reevaluate China's road from revolution to reform. So trying to figure out how on earth it was possible that a society that was dedicated to in-depth revolutionary activity during the Cultural Revolution, or even the whole period leading up to the early 1970s, in the span of a very short period of time, moved over to an era that emphasized different kinds of social and economic transformation, with a role for markets. I'm going to talk about that later on, though never entirely embracing markets, at least in the form that we would recognize them outside of China. So that's the idea here. We want to figure out, it's a good old-fashioned historiographical question. You know, we want to figure out how this happened and how people have dealt with it in the past, how they have understood this transformation. Some people have been asking us whether talking as we do in this book about the Chinese long 1970s is something that makes sense beyond its sort of slight Eric Hobsbawm's origins for this? Is it a meaningful concept? I think it is. I mean, I think it makes sense to look at this as one period and not divide it up the way it is certainly in official Chinese historiography, in thinking about a cultural revolution, so-called, that lasted from 1966 up to 1976, and then a reform period that starts soon after that. To me and to Chen Yen, this is one integrated period. And there might also be, and this would be interesting to discuss with you, Bob, there might be some connections going through this in terms of transformations that take place on a global scale. I mean, that's certainly true for the economic reorientation of China that happens from the very late 1970s on and into the 1980s. But it is also possible to argue, or at least we had fun with arguing, that if you think about the 1968 rebellions on a global scale, not as a kind of end point for what came before, a kind of end point of what happened in the transformation after the Second World War, but rather the starting point of a new era in which state-centered attempts at regulation and social contracts gave way to more individualism and eventually to more markets. It's possible that China, though in a different way from most of those who studied 1968 in a global sense before, that China fits into that account. It is clear, I think, that in terms of the global political economy, if that is where we focus on, by the late 1960s, the era of post-war reconstruction, which China in its way, socialist China in its way, had been a part of, had come to an end almost everywhere, and something else was starting up. So this work, of course, builds on a very significant series of studies that have been carried out over a very long period of time in the United States, in Europe, and in China. We've been much inspired by Rod McFarquhar's, now late great Rod McFarquhar's work on the Cultural Revolution. In terms of understanding Deng Xiaoping as an historical actor, we of course benefited from Ezra Vogel's biography. We benefited immensely from Fred Heaves and Warren Son's volume, much of their work, but especially perhaps their volume on the end of the Maoist era in China that came out a good decade ago. We also looked at work by non-historians. So the anthropologist Wu Yiqing's work on the Cultural Revolution at the margins, Yang Su's work on collective killings, Wang Ning on political re-education, and a book that I was drawing on as late as in my work today, after the first seminar, Bob, that we did earlier in the day, Li Xian's wonderful account of the Cultural Revolution in Shanghai, which unfortunately is not out in English, but I think is a kind of seminal work on the Cultural Revolution. So there is a lot to build on here. This is not entirely new territory. I think the periodization and the sort of broader understanding might be different from what has been there in the past, but there is a solid literature to build on, which is really good. Because what we try to do here is not just to look at high politics, but we want to try to look at the transformation of China in a broader sense. We want to look at social and economic and cultural and intellectual and labor and business history, as well as high politics. So the main hypothesis in the work that we are putting forward, I think, are three, and they could be summed up as follows. The first one, very important to us, is that more of the change that we see during these long 1970s, much more of the change came from below, came from outside the state and party sector. And much of it started earlier than what we have assumed before, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. We also argue, second main point, that this was a remarkably fluid period in Chinese history, that there were lots of different avenues that were open, that there wasn't a direct route, a direct road from the collapse of the Cultural Revolution over onto a Deng Xiaoping style, 1980s style reform era. The left was much stronger in terms of politics in China in the mid-1970s and could only be removed, as I'll talk about a bit later, through a military coup, which the so-called arrest of the Gang of Four in 1976 really was. So there were lots of different alternatives. There were extremes, we would argue, on the one hand, with China, if the political patterns have worked out differently, being a kind of latter-day Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, which the extreme left would have recognized as an ideal. Or on the complete different side of the party, towards some form of pluralism and openness, where there were people who argued, similar to other great turning points in China's history in the 1910s and the late 1940s, that China really needed more openness, a more open form of government and society. It could have gone either way. It could have gone in many different directions. There is nothing given about this. And then thirdly, one of the big mysteries, I think, for everyone, us included, who have worked on this era, why on earth, after the end of the Cultural Revolution, did not China return to some form of state planning of the Soviet type, which after all had worked quite well in China during the 1950s, before the Great Leap Forward? Why turn away from that and towards a very different form of organization of society and of the state? So the way we try to deal with this in terms of structure is that we look at different levels of transformation in terms of how they take place within China. We are looking more at the rural areas, I think, than some of the accounts of this time period have done. We look more at the South and what happens in the South. We look more at some of the aspects of cultural transformations that take place. We look, and this is where I hope that Carl has rejoined us, we look at consumption patterns and aspects of popular culture as they fit into these patterns of material culture. But of course, we also look, as I already said, at the political competition in Beijing. We look at key time periods, such as the overthrow of the left in 1976 after the death of Mao Zedong. And we look at the events around the third plenum in December of 1978, which most people, and I think we would agree in saying this, most people would say would be where reform really takes off, reform from the center. We also look at different ways by which things could have ended up very differently. We cover, for instance, a couple of assassination attempts against Deng Xiaoping, one of which came pretty close to succeeding. If it had succeeded, it's pretty clear that some of the history that we cover would have turned out differently. I mentioned that we are interested in what goes on in the South, and there are two main reasons for it. One is obviously economic. It is pretty clear to us when we've been looking at this material that much of the economic transformation of China during the long 1970s originate in the South. There are elements of these transformations in places like Zhejiang, Jiangsu as well, but it's most visible in Guangdong and parts of Fujian province. And it is, to me, a fascinating story because it is something that starts after the first most intense phase of the Cultural Revolution is over. So already in the early 1970s. And it starts from below. It is a kind of market revolution carried out in desperation by people, by families who knew a bit about how a market economy could operate, and who are deadly afraid that as a result of the turmoil that China went through, it would move back to a situation, even for them in Guangdong, that was similar to what it had been during and immediately after the Great Leap Forward. So in order to protect themselves against this, in many cases, there are these small businesses that come up completely against any regulations that happen from the central level, based on a barter economy, based on links to Hong Kong and Southeast Asia, already starting in 1972 and 1973. So much of this, in terms of the vanguard, was already in place when reform was decreed from the center. We place quite a bit of emphasis on the significance of families, significance of historical memory, on the role of the Huaqiao, of overseas Chinese in various forms. This, of course, becomes particularly visible after reform starts to take hold at the central level, but particularly in terms of these links to Hong Kong that I mentioned earlier on. You can see it happen already well before then, and particularly with regard to Guangdong. There is some evidence that we have worked into the research that we've been doing so far, but we're trying to find out more about. And work by people like Philip Tai has been very helpful with regard to this. Also linking Taiwan in commercial terms with parts of Fujian province. So obviously, these are stories of smuggling, as people at the center would call them. Local people would call them something very different: enterprise or ability to carve out some element of autonomy against an overwhelming state. But it is very interesting to look at this. So how smuggling, how currency fraud, how various kinds of contacts between China and its near abroad played a role in setting up the conditions of the pre-reform era. It's also very interesting to look, and we have some really good material on this, how collective enterprises and how, in some cases, people's communes, but certainly, at the brigade level, would be able to begin operating as independent economic enterprises. So very often, if you look at the early 1970s, in the cases when this happened, and I would not argue in any way, even in the most reform-oriented areas of Guangdong, that this was the overall pattern, but it was a pattern with some of these units, that they had two kinds of existence. They had an official existence, which meant that they delivered according to the plan that they were part of, what they were supposed to deliver in the state-controlled economic system. But then they had a second existence on the side of that was oriented towards a kind of barter economy, including in some of these cases that we've looked at with Hong Kong and with Taiwan. And this is, I think, very important for understanding this period in general. It's not just an issue of connecting up to reform at the central level. It's as much what is happening from below. It's also, of course, and none of you who know my earlier work would be surprised to hear me say this, it is linked, privileged by international events. It's very unlikely, at least to me, that Chinese reform would have been as successful as it were in the late 1970s and early 1980s if it weren't for the Cold War, if it weren't for the fact that the United States had a direct interest in facilitating China's economic reform and China's economic growth. In fact, what the Americans found when a lot of people have written about this. Carl has written about it. Chen has written about it earlier on. What the Americans found when they started coming back to China after the early 1970s was just how far behind China was in terms of technology, in terms of economy, in terms of science. The US leaders from Nixon to Reagan believed that they had got China as a partner in the attempts at containing and putting pressure on the Soviet Union on a global scale. But in reality, they discovered very quickly that China was far too weak to really play that role. And that put enormous pressure, I think, on the US side as well to contribute to China's economic transformation. If it hadn't been for that, I think many of these attempts at developing economic transformations, economic changes within China would, if not have failed, at least have taken a very, very long time to succeed. The fact that the Chinese state, after 1976 especially, made use of the security links with the United States to get technology and credit that was needed in order to carry out reform within China is of crucial importance, I think, to understanding what happened. And then finally, let me talk a little bit about sources for this, because we started working on this when the access to sources inside the PRC was far better than what it is now. We were able to draw on local archives, provincial archives. We were able to draw on access to libraries in Beijing and elsewhere that had material that had been collected during the time period that we are looking at, and had some level of classification in the past, meaning that it was not commonly available. So we were able to draw on a lot of those kinds of material. After access in China started to decline very dramatically, really over the last 5 years or so, that kind of access, or much of that kind of access was cut short. So we then had to go back and rely on other kinds of materials, especially for some of the things that we hadn't delved into, we really wanted to delve into, such as business history. I mean, for instance, we wanted to look at the development of some of the businesses that came out of the Yangtze Delta, out of Guangdong, out of Fujian. We are still able to do it, but not with the kind of access to even, at least in name, private archival collections as we had hoped for. So these changes have set us back a bit. I hope not as much that it would make this a different book from what it otherwise would have been. One final point on sources. So we have been able, at least up to quite recently, to rely to quite some extent on oral history, doing interviews with people at all levels of Chinese society. And this is the first time that I have done that on a bigger scale for a book. It's been a challenge, but it's also been tremendously helpful in order to get the book out the way we'd like to see it. Of course, we are now in the position where some of the interviews, and particularly the more informal conversations that we've had with people who live, or at least mainly live, in the PRC, cannot be attributed in full. This is a hazard, an occupational hazard, I think, for anyone who works in the China field these days. But we were lucky enough to be able to speak to some of the surviving protagonists from that time period. And that helped us a lot with putting things together that otherwise, even with the best archival access, in my view, would have been hard to understand. So I think I will leave it there, Bob and Carl, just as an overview of what this book is about, and then we can do the rest in conversation.
Thank you. Carl, did you want to jump in now, because in fact that you were off, and take some time? I just had one or two questions for Arne and let you do the rest so that you get a chance to participate.
Thanks. That's very nice of you. I think it's a little late in the day for me to return to the introduction, and I assume you finished introducing our speaker. Why don't we just continue as planned with your discussion, and then I'll start to field and prepare the questions.
Well, okay, this will be brief because I want to give you your fair share. This is, after all, your field.
Great.
Could you actually turn on your actual face? That would be really nice.
I'm afraid I will destroy
Well,
it.
you could, if you wanted, you could eliminate your virtual background. That'll help.
Does that take a lot of memory?
Yeah, it'll be easier. So I had originally intended, Arne, to ask you a question, obviously to compare to the Soviet case, but the Soviet case that I had in mind, I think I have an idea what the answer would be after hearing what you've talked about. But to what extent one can see this as similar or different to the phenomenon we saw, or some have written about, of Stalin in the late 30s, which is sometimes described as the Great Retreat, written about by Nicholas Timashev in 1946, of a moving back to traditional forms, to some cases capitalist forms of organization, both economic and also cultural as well. So we see retreats on the area of women's rights, end of co-education, and most importantly, I would argue, the return to hierarchy and an end of leveling procedures. And so I'm wondering if there's any point in pursuing this now that I've seen what you're doing about the ways in this is different. I think the thing that struck me immediately from what you said was the first thing you said, which is that so much of this comes from below. And as an outsider, this is surprising to me. So maybe you could expand on it.
No, it's an interesting point, Bob, or set of points, because what people have in mind throughout this period, maybe more than anything else, is the Soviet experience. In part because it's the only history outside of China that most people, or at least at the top levels in the Chinese Communist Party, would know a great deal about. So it's almost like what you got in the Russian Revolution during its first years, when it refers back to the French Revolution, right?
So it's not the net.
Well,
not a Chinese net.
The Chinese would do that, but not, they would do it for a longer period of time of Soviet history. I mean, for the Russians, of course, in the immediate post-revolution era, it was a relatively short period of the French Revolution that they referred to. It was a longer span of the Soviet revolutionary experience that the Chinese could refer to. So I think you're right about various aspects of changes in the Soviet Union. The Nieppe period, the late 1930s, but maybe especially focusing in political, modern economic terms on the 1950s. So this is, of course, where it links with the break between China and the Soviet Union. It was incredibly hard for these guys, even when they wanted to carry out reform in China, to move back and say, well, quite a bit of the criticism that we had carried out against the Soviet Union in the past was wrong. Even if we now, the Chinese now, are trying to go much further in terms of using market incentives and value incentives. So we've almost tempted at one point to write a chapter about these parallelities, these parallelisms in terms of Chinese and Soviet history. In the year 1976, for instance, this very dramatic year in Chinese history, everyone is talking in terms of Soviet parallels. Who is the anti-party group? How do we define like the Soviet Union in 1957, right? Who is the Khrushchev? Does Hua Guofeng have the right Stalin characteristics in order to run the party further? Turned out he didn't, right? So I think very often, Carl may want to comment on this as well, very often we forget how intimately Chinese history during this particular time period is connected to Soviet history, and how obsessed people on the Chinese side was with trying to figure out what they could learn from the Soviet Union, not just in obviously a positive sense, but also in a negative sense. Right. How could counter-revolution be avoided, right?
Okay,
In reality, what they ended up with was, in fact, a counter-revolution. But it
I
was
was hoping you would say that.
Indeed. I believe it was a counter-revolution. I mean,
Okay.
Chenggen and I have slightly different views on it, but I think the term counter-revolution is in place, right? I mean, I think that's how it came out as contrasted with the early Cultural Revolution years, and particularly in terms of the critique of the left, the way it was carried out. But we can talk more about that.
If it
Carl,
was
Carl, let me turn it over to you, Carl.
Well, I just want to follow up on your question, Bob. I see we have a lot of questions too. But if it was a counter-revolution, then when did it begin? How would you, for instance, talk about the other periods where they seem to make similar new economic policy reforms like they did in the Soviet Union earlier? For instance, in the aftermath of the Great Leap Forward, they implement a lot of similar kinds of policies that we see in much greater expansion in the early 1970s. So what is different from in the 70s, the period that you're looking at, from the earlier attempts to do the same sorts of things?
That's a really good question, Carl. So I do think that there are not just similarities, there's direct inspiration in terms of what happens in the mid, even late 1970s with what had been attempted in the aftermath of the Great Leap Forward. Though from fairly early on, there was a tendency to go further than what had been the case in the early 1960s. And I think that's connected to the two things that are dramatically different. One is what is happening from below, which I outlined in my talk, what is actually coming up through Chinese society, a Chinese society that is to some extent coming of age with regard to these kinds of transformations. And the second one is the shift in political power. The removal of the left. Part of the problem that Liu Shaoqi, Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping himself, and local reformers had in the early 1960s was, of course, that there was a very active left led by the chairman of the party himself, who were deeply skeptical of these kinds of measures. After the military coup in 1976, that was no longer the case, right? So that's where the difference is. Though I would agree with you that in terms of content, at least in terms of what was proposed at the central level, for a very long time, well beyond the Third Party Plenum in 1978, there are very direct similarities between what happened in the early 1960s and the late 70s.
Just to follow up one more time on that, what exactly do you see them, the opponents, as being skeptical of? Are they skeptical that this is in fact socialism that China is building, or are they skeptical that this economic strategy would work?
I think they are. So, I mean, of course, there are different groups here. So, again, as I said during my talk, there is, even in what we would define as the party left, there are different views. But I think the view that certainly is most pronounced at the political level, meaning at the central level, at the top provincial level, would be that this was, ideologically incorrect. It was not what the Chinese Revolution was about. The Chinese Revolution was to a very high extent about, as Mao liked to put it, put class struggle first. And then production should be increased, but only in line with the principles of class struggle. It's very interesting to see in two waves. So in the policy clashes in 74, 75, which in many ways sees the left, some people would say the ultra-left, what some people call the Gang of Four, at their peak and at their strongest political influence. And in the period after the military coup in 76 or 77, leading up to the Third Plenum, you had different groups arguing this same position, right? Saying that we have to put political rectitude first, we have to put what the chairman stands for first. And then we have to be much more careful with overemphasizing, particularly incentives-driven production increases. So I think, going back to your own work, Carl, I think one has to be very careful with believing that nothing of what happens after 1978 at the central level comes out of the past. I mean, I see many echoes of the past in this. But I also see a political and to some extent ideological transformation that could only happen in the mid-1970s, that delivers the kind of results that you get from the late 70s and early 80s.
Wow, fascinating. I have a list of questions of my own, but I saw Susan Shirk's hand up earlier. Sam, did you want to let her in? I also have another question waiting. While you allow Susan to ask her question herself, I'll ask this one. Did early interaction with Taiwan investors in the mainland produce effects beyond investment, jobs, and tech transfer? For instance, were there cultural and political influences?
Yeah, if I answer that one while Susan comes on, I think there were. I think even in that early time period that we are talking about, one thing that has surprised me is the degree of interaction that you see between people in Fujian province and people on Taiwan. Some of this, of course, has to do with the proximity of the Kuomintang-held islands, but it also has to do with a lot of interaction at sea. So, you know, a lot of people, and Philip Tai in his work has talked about this. There are a couple of Chinese authors as well who's starting to prepare book-length projects on this. So that's not just about smuggling, it's also actually about people moving in both directions for a shorter or longer period of time. I mean, this is the degree to which the ability of the Chinese state to control these kinds of relationships had actually broken down in the mid-1970s, that they couldn't even prevent that with the kind of security implications that you would assume that would have. So you have people operating in port cities, port towns in Fujian, who actually come from Taiwan and operate quite openly in Fujian in the mid-1970s and then go back. You also have people from the PRC who travel over not just to the islands but to Taiwan itself, spend some time there, and then come back. So yeah, this is a fascinating part of the story that we are trying to tell in the book.
Susan, let's see. Can you unmute yourself, Susan? Okay, there she is.
Yes. Hi there.
Hi, Susan.
Hi there. Nice to welcome you to UC San Diego. I'd like to hear more about your thoughts about coming from below. It's not entirely clear to me what your argument is. So can you say a little bit more about that?
So I think it's two things mainly, Susan. I mean, the first one is that in terms of the kind of market-oriented practices that developed in the South, and as I said, to a lesser extent in Zhejiang and Jiangsu, in some areas, not everywhere, they very much set up a framework that could then be employed on a much larger scale when reform was set in motion from Beijing after 1978. It put some areas, some units, some people in pole position to do that. One example that we use in the book is the number 3 Memory of Lenin tractor repair factory in Zhuhai, just outside of Guangzhou, or outside of Hong Kong for that matter, which already in 1973 had started repairing tractors outside of the plant, right? It would take tractors that needed to be repaired from other units, mainly in Guangdong province, but eventually also a little bit further away, repair them on the side of the plan, on the side of the allocation of tractors to repair, and then get payment in kind from the units that needed to have these tractors back as quickly as possible. And that payment in kind was then either bartered further within Guangdong province or smuggled downriver to Hong Kong. By 1973, mid-1973, this unit had a Hong Kong bank account. You know, if this had been discovered at the central level, if the central level had power to do something about this, these people would have been shot. And my argument is that they were willing to take the risks that they took, this is my second point, out of desperation. It was not that they necessarily believed that the market would make them very rich, or even that it would lead them towards a better existence than what they had. It was defensive. It was in order not to be pushed back to the kind of existence that they had had before, especially in the wake of the Great Leap Forward. So I think that's what's important for us in terms of looking at this from below. We are not arguing that the specific models of economic and social transformation that you see, say, in Guangdong, were necessarily the ones that were put in motion at the central level after 1978. I think that would be going too far based on the evidence that we have. But it certainly primed people and organizations, units, to behave in ways that they had already prepared for. And that gave them, you know, as Ezra Vogel would say, that made it possible for them to get one step ahead in Guangdong.
I just want to remind people to type their questions in the Q&A so that I can see them here. I had a follow-up question to Susan's while I wait for Tom Gold, Lei Guang, Emily Baum, and others to type their questions in. When I was researching a similar topic of the Taiwan's influence on China in the 1980s, I came across all these stories, and I was wondering if you had proof of these stories, that, for instance, the Taiwanese, as a form of propaganda, send balloons with Deng Lijuan's or Teresa Deng's music over, as well as canned goods and other ways to demonstrate that the material conditions in Taiwan, as well as the culture in Taiwan, was vastly superior as a way of sort of fomenting a dissatisfaction on the other side of the strait. Did you encounter any evidence of that? I
Yes.
wasn't able to stand by it completely because it sounded too apocryphal to be true.
We did, in fact, come across evidence of that, but it also became clear to us roughly at the same time that this was far less influential than the direct interaction that so many people who lived in these port cities along the Fujian coast had with Taiwan in real time. So I think the stories that they told about what was happening in Taiwan was much more significant than anything, you know, in a more propaganda-oriented sense that the government was trying to send over. It probably added, you know, it gave additional evidence for the stories that they already heard in these ports, you know, from people who were coming in. It's really striking to see how much this contributed. I mean, in terms of goods, already in the pre-1976 period, for some of these areas of Guangdong, of Fujian, and how good, you know, local power holders had become in leading inspectors from the central level, even of high government rank, who came to crack down on this in directions that took them away from seeing what was actually happening at the local level. You could almost write a book just about that.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for other questions to come in, but just as a follow-up to that, when I wrote that about Taiwan, the first question I always got was, what about Hong Kong? It was significantly more influential. I don't know if you're avoiding Hong Kong because your colleague Denise Ho is writing a terrific book on the interaction between Hong Kong and China, or whether you have another explanation for why you would focus on Taiwan rather than Hong Kong.
I don't. We don't focus more on Taiwan than we do on Hong Kong. I mean, Hong Kong, you're right in saying that Hong Kong was in many ways more significant. It was certainly more significant in specific material terms than what Taiwan was for, for good practical reasons, right? I like the Taiwan stories because they were more surprising, I think, to us. I always assumed before I started working on this that Taiwan, for national security reasons, was almost sort of hermetically shut off from what happened in the PRC, at least up to the reform era actually started. That turns out not to be the case. And in Hong Kong, as you know, we have quite a bit of work, including Denise's, that deals with that and will deal with that. I don't think we have all that much to add with regard to it, except what we get from the Chinese side in terms of how these connections, these smuggling routes down to Hong Kong actually worked. We also have spent a bit of time figuring out, this is going back to an earlier question, how then after 1978, in concrete terms, these proto-market operations that had been underway since the early 1970s in parts of Guangdong, how that put some units ahead to the extent that they could develop very quickly into very profitable companies, right? In Guangdong province. And this, I think, is really significant for China's history over the next generation. I think we would be willing to argue that without these moves that had privileged certain areas and certain units prior to 1978, that development would have taken a very different course.
Could you elaborate on that?
No, so I mean, for instance, in terms of some of the units that we've looked at, with one exception, all of them have become constituent parts of companies that are now among the biggest companies in China. And it's pretty clear that some of the early capital that was there in order to facilitate the first parts of that transformation came out of the practices that they had developed prior to 1978.
Okay, I have a different shift to a different kind of question. Most Chinese people think 10 years were lost from 1966 to 76. In your view, were there any positive role these 10 years played for China following 1976, the reform era?
So I think there were achievements during the Cultural Revolution era, as it is officially called in China, that also helped to prepare what came later. I think particularly in terms of literacy and in terms of public health, there's absolutely no doubt that, building on an earlier base, that there was considerable progress in terms of this time period. So that, I think, is generally accepted. But then there is the bigger question, which really fascinates us, which is whether China's market revolution, that of course comes much later than this, whether that would at all have been possible, at least in the form that it got, without the incredible work of destruction in terms of people's concepts and values and adherence to more classical forms of socialism that was wrought by the way the Cultural Revolution ended, right? Which was generally seen, as a failure. I think that is important in ways that we've struggled with getting. We have some way, I think, towards getting that now, but also in the wider literature has been problematic and sometimes, I think, underestimated. I think it is quite possible to argue that without that period of destruction, without that period of attacks on the old, that the Cultural Revolution signified, of course, for purposes that were intended not to privilege the market, but privilege socialism, right? Then the rapid transformation that came later would have been more difficult to carry out. So it's a kind of contrary argument in a way, but I think it's quite an interesting one.
I'm going to ask Lei Guang to ask his question directly.
Oh, I just typed my question into the question box. So basically, the way that, this goes back in some ways to the stereotype of, Chinese Communist Party being very pragmatic, and they learn and move in directions when things don't work out. So by the 1970s, they were definitely not on good terms, with the Soviets. And they tried that in the 50s, didn't work. It plunged the country into chaos. They tried to reverse that too sharply by the Great Leap Forward. That was a disaster. And then they went back to their toolbox, in Yan'an and all these things, and the 1960s, all the Cultural Revolution. So it felt that they have exhausted their tools in their toolkits, and just at this time, the Americans came along, and there were other things that were happening that made them feel that, well, let's try this. So it's a simple model of learning and doing by trying different things. There was never a hope that this reform path would have worked out, would continue. It's just one thing led to another. So there was no grand design or strategies by anybody. How about that interpretation?
No, I to some extent agree with that, though I still think it is puzzling that a party and a group of people that from its very origin had been wedded to introducing socialism in its Marxist-Leninist form in China, were over a relatively brief period of time able to move that quickly towards instituting market-led reform. Now, they didn't, as I said at the beginning of my talk, they didn't make China into a fully capitalist society, even a market-led society, or at least not for a very long time after our story ends. But they were willing to experiment with exactly the same kind of efforts and the same kind of initiatives that they had criticized the Soviets for moving towards in the past. So that's to some extent surprising. I think it's also surprising when you look at the constellations within the top level of the party in terms of how this started out. So I think, right after the coup in 1976, it's pretty clear that even the remaining majority, certainly in the Central Committee, but probably also in the Politburo, after the main representatives of the left had been removed, were people who were not particularly given to the kind of economic reform that some of the people who had worked together with Deng Xiaoping before his last purge had been starting to think about, right? So that's another issue that we have to explain, is how it was possible to move that quickly. I think the part of your question where you underlined failures in the past is very important. I mean, not so much because one didn't want to go back to the 1950s and the planned economy, but the idea that China could do even better, that it could achieve more in economic terms. And that's, of course, where the debates were held. I mean, all the way between 1976 and 1981, 1982. And then I think after that, it is the contact with the United States and the examples of particularly the consumer successes, or the imagined consumer successes of the United States, that come to overwhelm parts of the model. One wants to achieve in material terms much of what the Americans have achieved. And if one is going to do that, well, then it's quite likely that one would pick at least part in economic terms of the American model rather than the Soviet one.
We only have a few more minutes, and it seems like people type slowly because suddenly we have an avalanche of questions. I'm going to read off a couple of them, and then you can sort of sort through which ones you want to answer or how quickly you want to answer them. The first is Joel Andres at Johns Hopkins' recent book, Disenfranchised, suggests that worker power and autonomy was perhaps at its highest in the PRC history during the late Cultural Revolution period of the 1970s. Does your narrative reflect this trajectory? And second, from my colleague, Michael Moscalino, most of the discussion has been about Guangdong, Fujian, and so on. Do any elements of reform, as you conceive of it, originate in the interior as opposed to the coast?
Okay, so let me deal with those two. So first, with regard to workers' autonomy, I mean, this is one of the things that we find very interesting in the late Cultural Revolution years, is how far the left actually came in terms of trying to draw up models for how they should actually work. So, as I said during the presentation, one of the things that we're trying to do here is to take the left seriously. I mean, it's not to accept the standard version that the left were, you know, just a bunch of con men led by, horror of all horrors, a woman who imagined herself to have a place in Chinese politics. You know, we want to go further than that. We want to take them seriously. We've dug up an enormous amount of material on the political activities of the left during the first period of what we are looking at here. And we're now trying also to document part of their influence in a more underground kind of sense after 1976. And workers' autonomy was exactly one of the things that Yao and Yuan and others were working on in terms of proposals and suggestions in 1974 and 1975. In what I find, a bit against myself, a really interesting political discourse, where the big question is, within a state-led economic planning system, how far could you actually go in achieving workers' autonomy within the specific productive units? So they only thought of this for specific kinds of industry, and particularly located in the cities. They never developed similar models for what you would have in the countryside, which I think was one weakness in terms of this form of thinking. But much of it, you know, reflects similar initiatives that you find on the side of the European left in a certain period, ideas that were discussed in Cuba in the early 1960s, things that come back in African socialism in the 1970s and early 1980s. So, you know, if we think about this even in a global sense, I think this is an aspect of Chinese politics, though much reviled later, that should be taken seriously. The second question from Professor Moscolino, I think most of the transformation that we've been looking at actually does take place in the coastal areas. It wouldn't be right to say just Guangdong and Fujian. I think in smaller areas, Zhejiang and Jiangsu is also part of this story. Sichuan becomes significant a little bit later on. And then it becomes, and I don't have time to go into this now, but it does become significant for slightly different reasons. And it's much more connected to the political struggles that actually take place at the central level. So overall, the early wave of reform from below seems to have been a coastal, you know, river basin kind of phenomenon.
Well, you've ended perfectly at 6 o'clock, and of course we have many other questions, but that, I guess, is just a testament to how excited we are to read this work when it comes out. So on behalf of the many people who joined us today, I thank you for your time, and thank you for working on this topic.
Thank you very much, Bob.
Goodbye.
Everyone, it's a great pleasure to be able to talk to you today, and I look forward to the conversation. I mean, this is an ongoing process, I think, even after this book is published, to
yes.
try to make sense of that time period in Chinese history.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.